verse 157. Let's read it. That they said in boast, they here are a group of Jews, that they said in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the apostle of God. But they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For of a surety they killed him not. And the next verse declares, Nay, God raised him up unto himself, and God is exalted in power, wise. So, according to the Quran, some Jews were boasting about killing Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the apostle of God. Allah corrects them and says that they didn't kill him or crucify him. It only appeared to them that they had killed him and crucified him. Now, what does the Quran mean when it says that the Jews didn't kill or crucify Jesus, but that they thought they did because it was made to appear to them that they did? The Quran doesn't explain, but the traditional Muslim explanation goes something like this. Jesus went around telling people to believe in God and in the Torah. For some strange reason, this upset the Jews so much that they decided to kill him. But God had a plan. God took Jesus out of this world into heaven and miraculously disguised someone else to make him look like Jesus. And it was this other person who was crucified. But God made everyone think that it was Jesus. This is called substitution theory, the theory that Jesus was replaced by a substitute. There are numerous problems with substitution theory. Let's consider 4. First, substitution theory portrays Allah as a cosmic trickster, more like Loki than like the God of the Bible. If Jesus didn't actually die, but Allah made people think that Jesus died, the real reason billions of people are now convinced that Jesus died is that Allah did an outstanding job tricking everyone. Notice, according to the traditional Muslim explanation, you can't trust your senses. Even if you see someone die with your own eyes, Allah might be tricking you. And once you have an omnipotent deceiver running the universe, how do you know what to believe? How can you tell when the omnipotent deceiver you believe in is tricking you or not tricking you? Oh, because our prophet says, how do you know that the omnipotent deceiver you believe in isn't tricking you through your prophet? Second, the Islamic view portrays Jesus as a total failure. The Jesus of the Quran spent years preaching Islam only to have his life's work sabotaged by Allah, who tricked the world into believing that Jesus died by crucifixion, ultimately giving rise to Christianity.
Okay, the issue here is that the Quran never says somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. The Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, the Arabic translated into English says, it was made to appear to them, which is up for interpretation. It was made to appear to them doesn't mean somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. My personal view is that Jesus was crucified and that he survived his crucifixion. He didn't die on the cross. And I believe that is what the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157 is talking about. Jesus' survival of the cross and not death on the cross. This view is consistent with the New Testament Gospels, which describe Jesus being crucified, despite not naming any eyewitness testimony. Then he says, well, this shows that the Islamic version of Jesus is seen as a failure. Well, he needs to read his New Testament because the Jesus of Christianity is a failure as well, as Jesus was crucified, the ultimate sign of a failed Messiah. So according to Christianity, Jesus is a failure too because he was crucified. Also, Paul was the one who propagated or made up the death and resurrection of Jesus and spread that version of Jesus around as the gospel and not Allah or the disciples of Jesus. So Paul made up Christianity, not Allah or the disciples of Jesus. See Galatians chapter 1 verses 11 to 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 1 to 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 23. Paul received the information about Jesus' death and resurrection, or crucifixion and resurrection, not from the disciples, but by his own revelations or visions in his own reading of the Old Testament. So Paul started the Christianity that focuses on the death and resurrection of Jesus, not Allah or the original disciples of Jesus. Again, this is this is emphasized in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 to 12, where Paul says, I did not receive the gospel by any man, and I wasn't taught it. Rather, I was taught it by a revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 to 12, brothers, the gospel I preached does not come from man. Neither did I receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came to me through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul's preaching of the gospel does not come from any man. It doesn't come from the disciples. He didn't receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but he says he got it from revelation. So Paul didn't get the death and resurrection, which is the gospel, from the disciples, and he wasn't taught it by the disciples. Rather, he got it from revelation. In the New Testament, when the word revelation is used, it means like a vision or some kind of spiritual experience. So Paul got it from his own visions and not from the disciples of Jesus, as Paul himself says in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. To further illustrate that the first generation of Christians, which is the disciples of Jesus, taught that Paul's gospel was a myth. See 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 tells us that there were Christians saying that Jesus' death and resurrection was a cleverly devised myth. Also see 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 1. So the Christians were the first generation of Christians, which the disciples of Jesus, or the disciples of Jesus. So they were saying that the gospel, which is Jesus' death and resurrection, was seen as a cleverly devised myth. In other words, they didn't believe in Jesus' death and resurrection. The first, 2 generations of Christians, implying that Jesus' disciples were not teaching Jesus' death and resurrection. They saw it as a cleverly devised myth, as they were the first generation, of believers, or they were disciples of the disciples. And Paul's gospel, which he propagated, Paul was the one who invented, Jesus' death and resurrection, as he says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, was already spread by the time 2 Peter was written. So Paul's gospel was spread, and there were Christians in the time of 2 Peter, when 2 Peter was written in the late 1st century or the 2nd century, saying that Paul's gospel was seen as a myth, as a cleverly devised myth. The first generation or the second generation of Christians, which were disciples or the disciples of Jesus' followers, didn't believe that Jesus' death or Paul's gospel was a cleverly devised myth. So that means that the disciples of Jesus were not teaching Jesus' death and resurrection by the time Paul's gospel was being written, or by the time 2 Peter was written. So the conclusion we can draw from this, from the information here, is that David Wood is wrong. The Quran never says somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus, or somebody was made to look like Jesus and that person was crucified. Rather, the Quran says it was made to appear to them, which is up for interpretation. My personal view is that Jesus was crucified, but he survived the crucifixion, and that's what the Quran is talking about. Of course, Paul started the Christianity we know today, that Jesus' death and resurrection, and not Allah or the disciples, as he was the most successful Gentile missionary and got his gospel from visions in the Old Testament and not from the disciples of Jesus. Keep in mind, Paul was the earliest Christian writer. He was writing before, the Gospels, Acts, Revelations, etc., etc. So Paul was the earliest New Testament writer. His writings came first, and then the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came later. So it's very possible that his gospel influenced, or his version of Jesus, or his version of the death and resurrection of Jesus, colored the later Gospels, or his version of Jesus actually influenced the later Gospels. His version of Jesus' death and resurrection influenced the later gospel writers, and they got that information from Paul and not from the disciples. The information that Jesus was killed by crucifixion and was resurrected, not from the disciples, but from Paul, since Paul was the most successful Christian missionary, and his writings were dominant in the first century, and they would later on, his teachings about Jesus would influence the later Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's just one theory, but this is just my 2 cents on the whole substitution theory and what David Wood is talking about. Of course, David Wood doesn't do any kind of research on this. He just, takes one interpretation of the Quran and tries to make tries to mock it as much as possible. But he needs to be a little bit more educated on the origins of Christianity and what the Quran actually says, instead of spinning his own interpretations or putting his own subjective reading into the Quran. Stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead.